Welcome to a place where you can belong before you believe.
Wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we want to help you take your next steps toward Jesus.
We want to empower anyone, anywhere to join God's Spirit on the journey toward wholeness and flourishing.
We are both a gathered and scattered church, meeting on Sundays at Cascade Christian.
And in homes, parks, backyards, and online.
We have individuals placed all over Pierce County and beyond, planted by God in zip codes, workplaces, and networks.
We exist to send and support our people in these places to bloom where they are planted.
We are Garden City.
I'm Olivia, and I'm happy to welcome you to Garden City Church. Garden City is a place where you can belong before you believe. If you're new here or new to church, we would love to get to know you. So please send an email to info@gardencitynw.com to receive our weekly newsletter. Okay, Garden City ladies, we have an event you don't want to miss out on. Come enjoy a fun pretzel bar, appetizers and treats, make a succulent gift, and connect with others. Friday, May 20th from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Station House. We have another great event coming up for absolutely anyone. Join us starting May 15th after church for our 4-week spiritual growth track. We hope the Journey Track grows your faith in Christ, deepens your relationships, and clarifies your life purpose. Learning happens best in a community. See you next week. We believe God is just getting started at Garden City. Your generosity helps us create belonging and bless our community. You can give online or write us a check. Thank you so much for your support. Generosity is love in action.
We've been getting a lot of questions about the music that was made by plants in the Garden City bumper. So I'm here to take you behind the bumper.
Behind the bumper.
What makes this all possible? Synthesizers. The wavetable oscillator. Now that is the bread and butter. That is the sound generator. We go from there to the wavetable, to the VCA envelope generator, LFO, triggering the wavetable, which changes
Cool
the shape,
keyboard stuff.
coming out of the VCA into the reverb. Now, you might ask, where do the plants come in?
Plants.
I have this module, which allows a plant
Plants.
to send bioelectric feedback to the module. It translates that into control voltages. So here we go. I have my gator clips. We're taking those, connecting them to the plant. And that's how plants play music.
Wow.
Now that we know how plants play music, we thought we'd hook it up to our trusty fiddle fig. Now this fiddle fig has been with us through all of COVID. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen it grow, we've seen it shrink, we've seen it grow leaves, we've seen it lose leaves, and now it looks like this. Let's hear what it sounds like.
This has been Behind the Bumper.
Welcome to Garden City. This is a place you can belong before you believe. We've been in a conversation the last few weeks about learning how to cultivate our world with God toward a garden city. There's this narrative in Scripture that we see where God created a garden. The garden was kind of broken and lost, and then God sent His Son Jesus to begin restoring the world toward a garden city where this organic and organized, where humans with God are creating something beautiful together for eternity. A theme verse has been this: work for the flourishing of the city I have sent you to. Pray to the Lord for that city. If it flourishes, you too will flourish. That's Jeremiah 29:7. And you'll notice there's a tension sometimes between personal flourishing, like me growing, and we flourishing and growing. And in this verse, we see that if the city flourishes, we flourish. If our communities flourish, we do. And God wants both the individual and the community to flourish. How do you cultivate flourishing for both yourself and the community you live in? The Apostle Paul has a really cool take on gardening. It really, I think, is a little bit of his take on Jesus' teachings that you read in Matthew 13 about cultivating a garden. Any growth comes from God. So the ones who water and plant have nothing to brag about. God, who causes the growth, is the only one who matters. The one who plants is no greater than the one who waters. Both will be rewarded based on their work. We are gardeners and field workers laboring with God. You are the vineyard, the garden, the house where God dwells. So there's a few things just to kind of break this passage down. I'd just like to look at some of the theological truths in this passage, and then we're going to look at some really practical things about how to garden our lives together. So the first truth is this: God causes the growth. That means growth is grace. Again, Paul wrote, any growth comes from God. So the ones who water and plant have nothing to brag about. It's all God's grace. The second truth that I think is really important from this passage is this: we are not in competition with each other or other churches and leaders, and there's no favoritism with God. So we're not in competition, and there's no favoritism with God. Sometimes favoritism causes competition. Again, Paul wrote, the one who plants is no greater than the one who waters. Both will be rewarded based on their work. So they're the person who waters, the person who planted, there's no competition. They're actually on the same team. They just have different roles. And God doesn't favor one or the other. I just think this is a really important principle to remember as Christians. We're to collaborate with others, and we're all working for the kingdom. The next truth from this passage is we are gardeners and gardens of grace. Looking back at the passage, it says we are gardeners and field workers laboring with God. You are the vineyard, the garden, the house where God dwells. We're both gardeners and the garden. So we're gardeners with God. We're co-gardeners, co-creators. And that there's kind of this proactive element to our faith. And then there's also this aspect where we're also the garden, which is a little bit more passively receiving. And both are at play. God is gardening our life, and then we're also joining Him as gardeners. And here's the last theological truth I want to pull from this passage. And it's this: we are working with God the gardener. Paul says we are gardeners and field workers laboring with God. We're working with God. So all growth is grace, and all growth comes from God. But we do work with God to tend the gardens of our life. We don't just sit back in the lazy boy of grace doing nothing. See, grace is not opposed to effort. It's opposed to earning. Earning is a motive. Effort is grace in action. The purpose of gardening is for a flourishing future. What work is involved in cultivating a healthy garden for flourishing? Well, there's a lot of work that's involved with a garden. If any of you have ever gardened, or you've got an orchard, or you've done any work in a yard, I'm going to talk with you about some common and very practical areas of work that we need to do in a normal garden, but also in the gardens of our life. The first is tilling and tending. Tilling and tending the soil is important. Tilling the soil is an old term for preparing and cultivating soil for crops. The purpose of tilling is to mix organic matter into the soil, because you're kind of like breaking the topsoil up. It kind of controls or breaks up weeds. It loosens or breaks up crusted and hard soil so that you can actually plant seeds. And then tending soil, tilling and tending is just being attentive to, understanding the soil, like that some soil has a higher pH level and some soil is more acidic. And knowing that's really important because some plants flourish in more acidic soil and some in more basic soil. I'll give you an example. My wife and I love blueberry bushes. We also love rhododendrons. And although those plants are very different, they both love acidic soil. So a little trick that we use is we actually make like coffee grounds into water or spread the coffee grounds around the soil those plants are buried in. And they love it because it makes it more acidic and it's healthy for them. You know, another element of tending is sometimes farmers will let the soil rest. Which sounds kind of weird, like how do you let soil rest? But when you let the soil rest, it's really you're not farming it, you're not tilling it, you're not doing much with it. You just let it naturally regain nutrients and vitality and rest so that in another season it's going to be richer and healthier soil to plant in. Let me ask you a question. How are you tilling and tending the soil in the gardens of your life? The next thing is planting. Now, planting is casting seed to grow into a harvest. It's starting something new for a future fruit or flower. The soil and environment and season often determine when you might plant, and it will determine the health of what you're planting. I love this verse because it reminds us that when we plant, we're planting now in the present, but for a future hope. Listen to this. Those who plant in tears will harvest with shouts of joy. They weep as they go to plant their seed, but they sing as they return with the harvest. This little verse in Psalms is really giving us the idea or a picture of people in a famine where food is scarce and seeds are scarce. And there would be a real temptation in the middle of a famine where you don't have much. The temptation would be to eat the seeds that you have rather than planting them. But when you're eating the seeds, you're actually kind of erasing your future. When we plant today, it's really a step of faith for our future and trusting that God is going to bring a greater harvest in our future. So when you're planting in a time of tears, I think we can pray with faith and look forward with faith for a great harvest to come. Now, here's a word of wisdom I learned from my mom, who's a really good gardener. Sarah and I had gotten a new home. This was years ago. And we really wanted to plant a bunch of new bushes and trees and flowers and all that kind of stuff. And my mom said, "Why don't you just wait a second and see what seeds are already in the soil of your property? See what's there." And so we actually listened to her. What we did was there were some plants that we knew we wanted, like blueberry bushes, because we love them, and we knew they weren't there. So we planted some of those. But there were some other plants that we waited on. And we decided to wait for the first bloom, for the first spring, and see what was there. And all these flowers and tulips and daffodils and things we never knew because you couldn't see it on the surface were in the soil. And it was amazing to see what was already there. And so after seeing what we had, we were able to say, but we want to add this and this. And we also knew better where to put it. And we were able to better plant and create a garden that was really wonderful with things that we never knew were there. I want to encourage you to look for what God has already started in the gardens of your life, with your kids, your friends, your neighborhood, your work. Sometimes we rush to plant the seeds that we wish we had and the things that we want without seeing what God has already planted there in people and in places. If we rush to plant things without seeing what's already there, we could crowd out something wonderful that God has placed there already. Be proactive and wise with what you plant. What seeds are you planting with your life right now? The next thing is watering. Watering is for nurturing and wellness. Water is, that life-giving force for plants that helps actually the root systems grow healthy, and then it affects the type of fruit that grows or the flower that grows. It's important to have balance. If you don't have enough water, it obviously starts to wither away. If you have too much water, it can start to wither away. We learned this with our fiddle fig. You can actually have too much water, and you don't want to have too much. It's finding the right amount and just making sure that there's healthy roots that can get deeper and deeper so that the rest of the plant can be really, really healthy. So what areas of your life need water? And do you know the balance of having too much water or too little? Weeding is the next section, and most of you guys will know what that is, and that's simply pulling weeds out of the garden, because weeds tend to choke the other plants out. They either start sucking the nutrients that you want to go to the plants you want in the garden, or they begin to block the sun so that the plants can't, get enough sun for photosynthesis. We all have weeds in our life, and I think a good question to ask sometimes is, what weeds is Jesus asking us to kind of pull and remove from the garden so that we can have a healthier garden? The next area of work in a garden is pruning. And pruning is always for the purpose of prospering. Pruning isn't just for pain. If I were to boil it down, there'd be two elements of pruning. One is to purify, and the other is to prosper. So when you prune like a fruit tree, sometimes it's to purify. It's to remove maybe some of the unhealthy or already dead branches that are in the way. They're taking too much, some of the nutrients. It's not good. It's purifying, or maybe there's like some unhealth, like some kind of mold or something, and it purifies the tree. And then there's branches that are actually really healthy, but they might be taking up too much of the nutrients at the expense of the whole tree. And so at first it actually cuts everything back, but it allows for more to grow back in healthier ways. It hurts to be pruned. I mean, imagine if you're the tree. It doesn't feel good when branches are being lopped off, and branches that you cared about are being lopped off. Plant that is pruned looks weak and small at first, but pruning actually draws out the life-giving energy of the plant for greater health. There's almost like a bigger push from within toward health. In John 15, Jesus said this, "I am the true vine, my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit." That's the kind of purifying. And then he says, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it'll be even more fruitful. He prunes it for prospering. Many people are coming out of a major pruning time with the pandemic. And I think you could say that the church in North America has gone through a pruning time. And just like a tree that's been pruned, it can look a little sparse. It can look maybe different than we're used to it looking. Our lives, our churches, institutions. But as the church is coming out of a great time of pruning, and maybe you might be coming out of a great time of pruning, what God prunes, God prospers. Speaking about trees that may have gone through trauma, good gardeners will see when a tree goes through trauma that it might experience like a lapsed year or two where it doesn't produce any fruit. Jesus said you can tell a tree by its fruit. Well, sometimes if a tree has gone through trauma, if the tree was pulled up out of the soil it was planted in and moved, or it had just something awful happen to it, like a chunk was cut off, or it got struck by lightning, or something happened to the tree that was traumatic, it has these lapsed years or year. A good gardener knows that fruit will come if you give some time. Some of you may feel like this last year or two, you've been kind of ripped out of the soil that you were planted in. You may feel like you've gone through some traumatic things, and you might not even recognize yourself. And the fruit that you're used to seeing in your life, the way you're used to feeling, the way you're used to being and relating to people just feels different. And you might be asking, like, am I the same person? What's my identity right now? I just want to encourage you. God's a good gardener, and he knows that if a tree has gone through trauma, it's going to take some time to heal, but fruit is going to come. And God, he's a gardener who wants to nurture and help us get back to fruitfulness. Harvest, this is the last element I want to talk about with gardening. Harvesting is about bounty. It's about bringing in the fruit, bringing in all the abundance of your work. You can till, you can tend, you can plant and water and weed and prune and do all these things. But if you don't go and bring the harvest in, the fruit of your labor, everything's going to fall to the ground and rot. There's going to be waste and ruin. The harvest comes on its own time too, like not your time, but its time. And when it's ripe and when the harvest is ready, you have to run out and start bringing it in. Have you ever missed a harvest in your life because you weren't ready or you weren't looking for it? I remember when all these apples fell in our house. We had these apple trees and they fell, and it fell in a week where we were, I think, on vacation. We came back, they'd fallen, and we're like, came back from vacation and saw the apples are ripe. And we kind of waited a little bit longer because we had some other things going on. And by the time we got out there, a lot of the fruit was beginning to go bad. So we all of a sudden invited friends and neighbors, anybody who wanted apples, whether they're making pies, applesauce, whatever. Come on over, grab some apples. But it couldn't wait anymore because it was time and the apples were going to go bad. When the harvest comes, it's work, but it's good work. And we get to reap the fruit, literally the fruit of our labor. This week, as you go through the Garden City booklet, consider the reflection questions. They're going to turn your eyes toward the future of each of the 7 gardens. It's going to help you focus on what work you can do now today for a flourishing future. What tilling, what planting, what watering, what weeding, what pruning, what harvest can you do today for fruitfulness and flourishing tomorrow? I love Paul reminding us that we are gardening with God towards something beautiful, a garden city. I want to invite you to join us next week as we look at God's grand vision for what a garden city will look like in our future. Guys, I love you so much. And if this helped you, share it with a friend. See you next week.
Lord, I've got the world upon my shoulders, but you've been saying, child, put it down.
I prayed and prayed that you would take my burden, but you keep saying, child, put it down.
Maybe I'm addicted to the worry. Maybe I'm a slave to holding on. Help me put it down. Help me put it down. 'Cause I've heard it said the gospel is rest. Oh, how I need it. Say it again until I believe it. Oh, how I need it. Oh, how I need it. Lord, you put the world upon your shoulders, and all I have to do is set it down.
I'm living like some weary beast of burden, but you keep saying, child, put it down.
Maybe I'm just trying to be the hero, fighting wars that you've already won. Help me put it down. Help me put it down. 'Cause I've heard it said the gospel is rest. Oh, how I need it. The gospel is rest. Oh, how I need it. Say it again and tell